Thank you all for coming. It's my pleasure to share my journey, how I got here, with you today. And I will be focusing on some of my research with deaf adolescents and their health literacy as well. You notice the winding path? So when I look back, that's kind of the way my path has been. Hopefully you will enjoy the purpose of being here and learning from me. I was born in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. It's the red dot right there in the middle of the map. My parents found out, well, they adopted me at 3 months of age. But at that time, they did not know that I was deaf. They found out that I was deaf when I was 12 months old. My parents love to tell this story about how that happened. Basically, I was in my room, I was in my crib, and I was laying down facing the wall. My mother came into the room and vacuumed. I was still looking at the wall. I didn't respond. I didn't get up. I mean, normally you would expect that a baby would start crying when they heard such a loud device. At that point, my mother did a couple experiments. She went up to the crib, and she yelled at me. She said, "Scott! Scott!" With no response from me, I continued to look at the wall. When she touched me, then I turned around. So at that point, my mother knew, at that moment, that I was deaf. What's really interesting is at that time, I felt very fortunate because my parents just happened to be members of a church who already had a program for deaf and hard of hearing people. There were interpreters who were already there. So my parents already recognized that there were deaf people who were doing well, who had families and children. And so my parents knew very well that that was the environment that I had to be in. I was introduced to everyone. They were told that I was deaf. It was a key moment that my hearing parents had already been exposed to deaf people. And therefore, they were willing to do interaction and gather information. And that helped me in my youth and my experience. But of course, my parents also took me to the doctor. Of course, my parents made sure that hearing tests were taken care of and such. And so I did use hearing aids as I was growing up until I was about 12 years old, at which point I decided that I didn't want to use them anymore because the excess static noise was disruptive. And I didn't find that it was giving me that great amount of benefit. So it was also maybe giving me headaches, and it was very distracting for other people. So I decided to take them off at that point. And since then, I haven't touched a hearing aid. So my parents decided that it was probably best to give me both English and sign language. So a bilingual model was what they chose. I felt very fortunate about their decision. Also from the church, my parents became really good friends with a deaf couple. They came over to the house, they interacted with me, and so they were my role models. I was able to play with their children. Their children were codas. They were hearing children of deaf adults. And so I believe that that benefited me quite a bit. I call them my godparents. And they told my parents, they suggested that I go to a public school and not a school for the deaf. They didn't feel that that education at the time was sufficient. It wasn't strong enough. And it might be better for me to stay in a mainstream classroom. So they didn't send me away. If I had gone to a residential school, I might have stayed there for a week and only seen my parents on the weekends. My parents would not have been satisfied with that. So they decided to keep me in public school, which actually had to be fought for the government at that time. I remember meeting with the governor of the state, shook their hands, got my picture taken at the brave age of 4. I had basically a sign on me that said that I was a deaf child. And I spoke in front of the Assembly, the House of Representatives in North Carolina, and they arbitrated for a specific funding to help. And that was in 1974. That's when the idea of Individuals with Disability Education Act came through and was passed. So I feel like I've been at the perfect time for many times during my life, at which point I entered kindergarten until 5th grade. I was in a group of 8 to 12 students, and the teacher knew sign language. So I was mainstreamed for 1 or 2 classes like reading or social studies or such, and an interpreter would accompany me to those. At 5th grade, they made the decision that I couldn't stay in that class. That would be holding me back. So I wasn't doing well on the exam, so they decided that it would be a better idea to mainstream me into advanced classes. So I was the only deaf student from there on in. Yes, I always had an interpreter with me. Then after I graduated high school, I was valedictorian. I was the first in my class. And so I was the only deaf person of about 450 students. I decided to go to college at the East Carolina University, ECU. They already had a program for deaf and hard of hearing people with staff interpreters and note-taking services. So it was similar to CSUN. And I thought that I might be going to CSUN, but my mother said no. It's too far away. So I decided to stay closer to home. I got a full 4-year scholarship, and it was also cheaper because I was an in-state resident. So I was in college for 4 years. Of course, that was fun. It was some of the best years of my life. I really enjoyed that experience. I majored in biology, chemistry, and biochemistry, 3 majors. I also did undergraduate research in my biology department. So I got a flavor for research was. That was the first time that I thought that I might want to participate in some research. As I grew up, I wanted to maybe find a cure for cancer. I mean, that was certainly one of my dreams when I was younger. And during the summertime at college, I did an internship working at the local medical company. It was Burroughs Wellcome Company. That was the first time that I experienced lab work. Very isolating. All day long, just doing chemistry work. And that was the type of research that wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. And again, it didn't help that I was the only deaf person there. There really wasn't any interaction. That was very difficult for me. So that increased my feeling of isolation even more. So my big decision during college was what to do. Did I want to get my PhD? Did I want to get my MD? Again, I was in the right time at the right place. The ADA was passed in 1990. So I thought that I wanted to capitalize on that chance and see if maybe I would be able to get into medical school using the ADA to back me up. Now, technology at that time, if you remember, this was just when computers started to come on the scene. And technology was very nascent at that time. And I decided that it might be a better chance to get into medical school and succeed. So this is around 1991, my junior year, and I decided to apply to medical school. I applied to 15 medical schools, and that's about average for most people who are applying to medical schools. I got 3 invitations to interview. It was, long story short, one of them would give me a 4-year scholarship, private medical school in North Carolina, which was terrific. And it was important that I was deaf because they didn't read my essay. They looked at the source and saw my grades and all my transcripts and all of that, but they didn't actually read it. And I told them that I was deaf in there with explanations and such, not needing extra technological support or anything. I decided to go ahead and bear it all. And in that specific medical school, didn't even read the essays. So when I called for an interpreter for the interview, they said, "An interpreter? What do you mean? Don't you speak English?" No. At that moment, I knew that they hadn't read my essay. So I did still end up going to the interview, but it was very cold. Some of the doctors said that I probably had somebody else write the essay for me. They could not believe that I was able to answer some of their questions. The second point, I went to a private medical school in Washington, D.C., but the problem was that the interpreting was kind of like, church interpreters, people that are kind of brought in that don't really have the proper qualifications for this type of interview. And so I sort of had to dumb it down, as it were. So, because they wouldn't have been able to keep up with the vocabulary that I was using. So, ending up, it was a successful interview. The medical school was at the same university that I had attended as well. So it was kind of like a home field advantage because they already knew me from my previous 4 years being there. So that made it much, much easier for me to be able to enter medical school because I had already gone through the program there. I had already had interpreters ready and waiting to work with me to assist me going through medical school. So you might wonder why I wanted to become a doctor. I definitely wanted to help people. Some of my family members, when I grew up, had died of cancer. And that's what had brought me to wanting to help people. I also wanted to prove to the hearing world that a deaf person, such as myself, who doesn't speak, who signs, someone like me can be a doctor. Now, medical school was a very interesting experience. It was like they say, I had to learn a whole new language. Very fortunately, I had 2 dedicated interpreters who became really good friends of mine during my previous college years, and we worked together as a team. So basically, we had to invent new signs or new sign language to match this new language that I was learning. One of them would be on call, who would stay with me all night long, and the other interpreter would go home, and then in the morning they would switch off back and forth. The point was that we had good teamwork. If those interpreters were not willing to do that, then I wouldn't be standing here talking to you all today. See that picture up there? That's an example of the technology that just happened to be invented at that time. Here's the fancy word for it, phonocardiogram. Basically, it means that it shows you a picture of what the sounds are like of the heart. So I'm able to follow that and use that as a diagnostic tool during my medical school experience during physical evaluations. Altogether, it was a very positive experience because the dean of my medical school was a tremendous champion for me, and he really wanted to see me succeed. He wanted to see me make history. My third and fourth years in medical school require you to make a decision into which discipline you wish to get into. So you go through different rotations, tasting different areas. At first, I thought that family medicine would be a good choice. But then I decided against it because many of the older people would have a hard time dealing with an interpreter. They wouldn't understand why that person was in the room with me, with us. And they might not feel comfortable with that idea and the trust that would be required to be developed through an interpreter. And at that time, I understood that a lot of people do not have exposure to deaf people. There were no deaf people on television, or it was very minimal. So it was probably a good reason not to get involved in family medicine at that time. It wasn't appropriate for me. My next choice might have been to, well, as I went through rotation, I became familiar with OBGYN, and I enjoyed that area. Birth of babies. I saw 12 born during my medical school years. I thought that that was fun and enjoyable and a very positive experience. Mothers tend to be young and more open-minded to having an interpreter in the room, and so I thought that that would be a fabulous experience. But the problem with OBGYN is that you have to do surgery as well, like C-sections. So, and OB surgery as well. Oh, he himself was a famous OBGYN practitioner, and so called around to a number of different places and discussed the possibility of me becoming an OBGYN. And at that time, they didn't feel that they were comfortable with that. So when I actually went in to do the surgery with a mask and an interpreter, and they were concerned about how I might communicate with the surgical team and such, that I understood that, yes, that would be quite an obstacle. So my third choice was pediatrics. Because children, I just love children, and children like me too. I think we get along very well. They think that sign language is just fascinating, and they think it's really cool. And it makes for some very interesting experiences going to the doctor. I mean, if you remember, your mother would say, well, most of the time my kids don't want to go to the doctor. They refuse to go to the doctor. But when I say that they're going to go see you, well, then they're fine with it. So getting that type of positive feedback really cemented it for me.
So I entered residency at that time and decided that I would like to stay at the same hospital. I wanted to move, indeed. I stayed at the same university for my undergraduate degree and medical school for 8 years, and I wanted to move. But for my residency, because of the intense experience that it is, I decided to stay where I was. And I was matched with the pediatric department at the same hospital, and they were very supportive of me. Pediatricians tend to be more female pediatricians and more open-minded, and it felt like a better match for me at that time. Understand that during my residency, I would be on call for, 3 or 4 nights at a time. And I had the big pager that would vibrate, if you remember the pagers at that time. But the problem was, if there wasn't anything to do, I would go lay down, take a nap, or sleep, waiting for a call. And I was afraid that I wouldn't hear or feel my pager and wake up. So I didn't like that feeling of paranoia and maybe missing a call. Now, of course, technology has changed and it's a different story, but at that time, thinking about my future in general pediatrics, I would have to be on call very often, sometimes even every night. You know, patients didn't come to my house. There was no VRS at that time either. No relay service, really. So I thought about it, and I decided maybe I should take a step back and look at academic medicine and research related to that, public health policy, and maybe help people in general or more one-on-one. That's when I decided to apply for a postdoc fellowship in Boston. I worked at Massachusetts General Hospital. I chose this fellowship because I felt less of a need for an interpreter. It was my chance to get out of North Carolina as well. I had the opportunity to do research that would have more broad impact than just clinical work. This was definitely an interesting experience. I worked with a famous mentor. Now he is the president of American Academic Pediatrics.
I got a grant to study the clinical experiences of parents with deaf children.
We sent a survey to 150 families, and what I found from that was their experience with when the doctor tells them and how they approach the doctor. It did have an impact on how the parents viewed their child's deafness, whether it be positive or negative. It seems that if people's doctor emphasized the need for a cochlear implant or a hearing aid, then parents tended to have a more negative perspective. And during that time, I got my MPH, Master's of Public Health, at Harvard School of Public Health. I learned about research, statistics, epidemiology, and so on. I did clinical work 1 day a week there in Boston at the Center for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Children. I focused more on developmental experiments to see if they were doing well in school, if everything was going along okay with them, also related to children with ADHD. I was the only deaf person in that environment. I had no support from any other deaf people. So when I would try and write my papers about my research, I had a hard time. I felt like I wasn't able to explain myself very well. I had a hard time publishing articles as well. It was a good experience, but because of my positive experience in clinical work, what I developed at that point, I decided that I would try and go back to clinical work in developmental behavior of children. There were no overnight on-calls. That was another reason I chose that field. There were, no emergencies with ADHD, so I knew that that would not be an issue. I felt more comfortable in that field, in that area, so I decided to go back to the clinic. That was at Tufts New England Pediatric Center. It was a wonderful experience for me working in that clinic. I very much enjoyed the positive feedback and working with children. And of course, there are always some issues working with interpreters. We thought that the state would take care of the interpreters, hiring the interpreters, and have a referral service, but that ended up being an issue. So we had issues with the interpreting services that way. Another challenge I faced was writing reports. Most doctors dictate their reports. They speak into a recorder and maybe speak 100 words a minute or something. And that's how they finish their paperwork quickly. I had to take my paperwork home and work on it there. So I would work in the clinic all day. When I finished, I would go home and type up my reports. Maybe 3 or 4 hours every night required for that. I loved what I was doing, but the paperwork became a big issue. It was overwhelming. I experimented having the interpreters help me with this. I would sign to them and have the interpreters dictate, but then they would have trouble knowing exactly what I wanted to say or us wording it correctly. It wasn't a horrible experience or experiment, but it was just not exactly my report. If I would get my report, I would say, oh, this is not exactly what I said. This is not what I meant to say. So I would still have to edit my paperwork. So it would still take 2 or 3 hours every evening for me to work on my paperwork to make sure it was exactly how I wanted it to be. So I finished my clinic work, and it was a positive experience. I still wanted to practice in that area. So I had the opportunity to move here to Rochester. My fellowship director, he knew someone here who worked here. They went to medical school together 30-some years ago, and so he contacted this person, and there was an opening at the hospital at that time here in Rochester. So I became a full-time clinical practitioner with pediatrics. And again, it was a great clinical experience. My challenges have never been about interacting with my patients and their family. It's typically been about paperwork or interpreters. Who will pay for the interpreters? How will I increase my productivity? And how will I keep up with the money and all those types of things? Insurance company would not pay for services that I needed. Pediatricians kind of are lower on the list. You know how teachers feel. That's kind of like that. Yeah, we're lower on the totem pole. I did face some challenges with people who were responsible for the bottom line, for the money part of it. It became worse and worse over time. I was there for 4.5 years, and it was a good experience still, regardless of all of those challenges. I decided enough is enough and decided to go back to research. And I found NCDHR, the National Center for Deaf Health Research. They were just being founded at that time. And finally, I could get more support from other deaf people who were willing to work with me. People who were willing to work with me and help me write grants as well. So I got a fellowship for the 3rd time, a postdoc fellowship for preventative cardiology. The director of NCDHR at that time was a cardiologist. And he was very skilled and had multiple publications. So I had the opportunity to work at NCDHR, and I worked on several projects there. I learned how to translate their surveys from English into ASL and vice versa. At that time, I developed a KO1 grant, and I will explain more about that. This was from the National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute, and again, because of the director, I was able to be involved with this. We studied cardiovascular health, knowledge, and literacy. We had a wonderful team. I had a wonderful team of mentors to help me and support me through this process. There were several courses that I had to take, kind of refreshers, really, a review of things that I had learned before, survey research methods, and qualitative research methods as well. And I had some protected time to develop my academic credentials. So I got that grant, and I became an assistant professor at the University of Rochester. 75% of funding is from the K grant. I focus on research projects, meetings with mentors, the NCDHR team, department and university activities as well. And then 25% of my funding is from here at NTID, and I'm very thankful to NTID for their support of me. And it's a wonderful opportunity. I work on the Healthcare Implementation Commission, and the goal is to increase the number of deaf and hard of hearing people who enter healthcare fields. I'm also involved with the Rochester Bridges to the Doctorate Grant, which is a wonderful experience. And I work with the EYF, the summer camp program here at NTID, to expose deaf high school students to the possibilities, the possible future careers that they could have, public health or healthcare. So that's where I am now. That's my journey to get to this point. And now I'll switch over and talk a little bit more about my research. I'm nearing the end of my 5-year grant, and I focus on health literacy of deaf adolescents. So the question is, why do we care, or why should we care about healthcare literacy? I feel it's because evidence shows that there is a weakness in deaf adults compared to hearing adults. And that seems to lead to deaf people having more health problems as they get older. And this is similar to people who recently immigrated from another country to the U.S. NCDHR does a health survey for deaf adults, or they did a health survey, and found that deaf people have a weaker health and are at a higher risk for cardiovascular disease, obesity, an increase in IPV, which is intimate partner violence, and an increased incidence of suicidal thoughts. In my opinion, all 3 of these are related to stress in some way. Deaf people tend to feel isolated and don't necessarily have access to health care information. I'm a pediatrician, and so NCDHR focuses, the previous research focused on deaf adults. I am focusing on deaf adolescents. I do this because adolescence is a key point for learning, and it's a point of impact for their future. If people are already 50 or 60 years old, they're already set in their ways, so to speak. Kind of, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but that's not the same for adolescents. Right, that's not always true. Yes, that's correct. But adolescence is an age at which children stop asking questions because they know all the answers. They know everything already. And there's no data about deaf adolescents so far, so it was perfect for me. I took advantage of that opportunity. So the question is, how do you measure this health knowledge? And if we change the measures to match the deaf people, how do I give an equivalent measure to hearing people if I'm comparing the two groups? I think it's more important to see which subgroups of deaf people may have a better or worse health literacy, and we can learn from that. Knowing that can help us to improve deaf health literacy for all deaf people.
The first time in 10 years that we've had any type of deaf health literacy. It's a very, very new concept. So far, the focus has been more on reading and writing, which is more of a functional healthcare literacy. Here are some examples of different measurements that have been done. And what does that tell us? Duh, most deaf people have a little bit of a problem with English. So therefore, they probably have weaker functional health literacy. That really was not informative. But still, I did choose one of those to include in my survey, mostly because it's never been done. And I had to have some type of documentation, some type of facts that, yes, deaf people do actually have some weaknesses in functional health literacy. So here's a newer concept. Starting with functional health literacy is very important. It is foundational. But it's much more than just that. You might have interactive health literacy and then critical health literacy built on top of that. The interactive means how do you get the health information? Through socialization, through getting the information from your environment. And then critical health literacy is then how do you analyze that information? Is it true? Is it false? Should I trust it? Should I not? Should maybe I check up something on the internet? That type of skill would be critical health literacy. Health literacy also depends upon the specific deaf person's issues. Are their parents deaf? When did they become deaf? How old were they when they learned sign language? These types of things no one had really been studying in the medical field. Most of the researchers at that time were not really thinking about this type of specificity within the subgroups of deaf people. There are many, many more measures that are better than just a functional reading and writing literacy. These are more performance-based metrics, meaning that if you give some type of information, it could be a map, or it could be a picture, or a graph, or something like that, and then ask questions about it. And the person would have to answer based on the information that is provided. Here's one that I chose, the Health Literacy Skills Instrument. I considered that one the best one. It's 10 short questions. It takes maybe 7 minutes to complete. Also, I felt it was more important to ask about their interactions, what their interactive skills are, what their critical skills are. There haven't been very many measurements that have focused on these. And so my goal was to develop a new survey to try and capture those concepts. This is where it's important to have qualitative research. If you're interested in, say, learning something new, you want to develop a new survey and new measurements, which hadn't been done before. So this qualitative research was a good way to sit down with focus groups and interview people and get the themes that would be coming up. And that would help me to develop any new survey tools. I focused on where do they get their information about healthcare, and how do they experience getting that healthcare information from any number of sources. Again, the point of this is specific deaf demographics. Do they use hearing aids? Do they use cochlear devices? Do they identify themselves as deaf or hard of hearing or hearing impaired? Do they have other deaf family members? What's their educational background? Did they go to public school or a residential school? How do they communicate? Do they communicate with their family? Do they communicate with their friends? There are many, many questions, and nobody had been asking them. So I felt that we really needed to capture all of these so we could make the best use of the data to develop effective surveys for later research. The knowledge is key for health literacy as well. You can't answer the question about something that you don't know about. Even if you can read fine, even if you're the smartest person in the world, if you do not know anything about a certain topic, then it's very difficult to understand how to make correct decisions for your health care. Confidence also seemed to be important. Do you feel confident? Are you able to make better decisions that way? Not always the best decisions, but at least you're confident. Those two had been included in my survey. There were 117 questions. Well, okay, that does seem a little bit long, but understand that they're mostly short questions, and people are able to answer those questions pretty rapidly. Through feedback and consultation with different people, experts, deaf people, people who had not had any interaction with the deaf community, gathering all of this feedback, I was able to improve my survey. Okay, English to ASL is a must. You have to provide a signed survey for equivalence. Not all deaf people necessarily need the sign language, but you have to offer it that way. That way it will make the information more accessible. It had to be translated into two versions, a sign language version and a much more ASL version. The one was more English-based. And we did cognitive interviews as well. We met one-on-one with the people. They would take the survey, and then we would ask them, what did you think about the survey? Did you understand it? What did that word mean to you? After revising the survey, it was translated back into a format for a laptop. So that way people could take it on their own. I wouldn't have to be involved. I wouldn't have to tell them anything. I would just set up the laptop and they could take it themselves. And understand, I made exactly the same survey for the hearing adolescents. However, there wasn't any sign language. It was a person speaking. That was a new idea for most researchers. Most researchers didn't think about that option. And I felt that if I was going to be giving deaf people somebody who was signing in ASL or English, well, then we should give hearing adolescents somebody who is speaking in English. That would make it more equivalent between the two groups. So this is what my survey looks like as well. Here you see a person signing, and you can see the English written, and the questions and the answers, and then other information on the side. So they're supposed to use that information to answer the questions that are posed. The point is, it's signed and spoken, and then the person takes the survey. That way, it's not about their understanding of the question itself. Do you get me? So you can eliminate that bias, and it's more focused on, do they understand the information? So that would be the functional health literacy part of the exam. It's just like going to a gastrointestinal doctor and you're not supposed to eat anything after midnight, that type of information. And then the blanks, for the blanks you have to choose the correct word out of 4 options and place the correct words in the blanks. So it's based on a functional health literacy survey. Here are the knowledge questions. It's been completely translated to both English, spoken English, and sign language. And this is the same thing with the confidence and the interactive health literacy survey. It's also been completely translated. Why hadn't this functional literacy been translated? Because the point of that measurement is to measure their reading and writing skills. So obviously, at that point, you wouldn't want to translate that particular measure. But for all of the others that are not related to functional literacy, then those were translated. And here are the participants for the research. We're almost finished with the analysis of this survey. And this compares deaf and hearing adolescents. The deaf were from the EYF program here, the Explore Your Future program, and the hearing adolescents for a summer camp program at the University of Rochester. So they are comparable groups, but obviously they're not identical. Those are 2 separate programs that they were drawn from. The deaf subgroup were a little bit older, 17 as a mean as opposed to almost 16. Notice the gender differences. The deaf people tend to be more white. The hearing adolescents had a little bit more ethnic diversity. For parental education and family finances, it seemed that the hearing group were a little bit higher on this measure than the deaf participants. Even though the groups were different, we did go ahead, and in the analysis, we took control for these differences.
I think this is more interesting related with the deaf group of adolescents. 82% became deaf before they were 3 years old. 65% had language fluency. 72 fluent in English, 38 fluent in both languages. I think that's fascinating, that we have a high percentage, but not many said that I am fluent in both languages. 60% said I am deaf, identified as deaf. not hard of hearing or hearing impaired. 40% were from schools for the deaf, and 40% were mainstreamed. 20% went to both, maybe half a day in residential school and a half a day in mainstream school. So this is a natural representative sample. I think it's the best sample that I could get. The EYF program is wonderful. The students come from all over the country. The HLSI goes from 0 to 10. The deaf adolescents are much weaker than the hearing adolescents. For the functional health literacy is not very surprising. Again, you get the idea, 0 to 36, I think we had 36 fill in the blank questions. Remember I showed you where they filled in the blank? So I counted 1 point for each right answer. The deaf averaged 26 right answers, and the hearing were 34 average. Again, a statistical significant difference. Again, with the age and gender and race and all that, there's still a significant difference. Knowledge. This was based on percentage of correct answers. The deaf group had about 37% of the cardiovascular questions correct, and then 52% were the hearing group. These were tough questions. I mean, I think I even missed a few myself. They were tough questions. But the point is, there is still a significant statistical difference in the heart health knowledge between the hearing and deaf groups. And again, of course, controlling for all the demographics as well. There was a significant difference. But confidence, talking about confidence. There was no significant difference in the two groups. Deaf felt as confident or close to as confident as the hearing. That's a bit worrisome, actually, because that means that the deaf group, the deaf adolescents, don't necessarily realize that they're missing information. So now, more interesting, we controlled for their reading and writing skills. We took that part out completely and focused on their overall health literacy, their heart disease knowledge, and their confidence. So their overall health literacy and the heart disease knowledge still showed a significant difference, even when we took out their reading and writing skills. To me, that means that the deaf health knowledge and literacy is not about reading and writing. There is more to it than just a weakness with the English skills. So those with the best health literacy were hearing, white, parents with higher education, and parents who have a family history of heart attack or stroke or other heart disease. I believe that's related to these children seeing or observant learning. When you see it in front of you, something happening like that, it makes you aware of it. And that means that you'll probably know a little more about that topic. So in the deaf group, the strongest with the health knowledge and literacy remember, there was a percentage that said that they were fluent in both languages. That was the group that had stronger skills or health knowledge and literacy. And those who said that they were fluent in English, this shows that there is a benefit to having ASL as well, having a bilingual education or knowledge to increase your health literacy and knowledge. And also those who labeled themselves, identified themselves as deaf, not hearing impaired or hard of hearing, but those who identified themselves as deaf had a stronger health knowledge and health literacy. Why do you think that is? Why would these two groups have a better health literacy? Anyone? That's my next research project. That's my goal, is to research why these two groups have such a stronger knowledge and literacy. Is it because of access? If you're bilingual, then you have more access, typically. Both sign language and English can help you have more access to the knowledge. Also, those who identify as deaf probably interact with the deaf community more. And they're able to use the deaf community as a source of health information to gain from, and not just depend on English and the hearing world, but they're able to access the information from others who use sign language. So my future work is on an R type of grant, and I want to focus on these two specific groups. I'm very interested in the role of informal learning. I believe health knowledge is one of those subjects that people aren't really excited about. Oh, I'm going to run to the computer and I'm going to learn all about heart disease today just because I want to. I don't think so. I think health knowledge is something that requires something happening in the environment around you. You pick up on something and realize, oh, I should be more aware of that topic or that issue, and then take control of your own knowledge and research to find out more about them. It seems to be a specific type of knowledge that depends on informal learning. Health knowledge is one of those types of information. I want to thank my wonderful team. Some of you are here today. Peter Hauser back here. So it would not be possible for me to do the work that I have done without all the support, both at the University of Rochester and here at NTID.